It doesn't make any difference how the other people walk and what they do. What matters is my response and how I'm going to walk. And I say that because now it carries over into chapter 6, verse 1. He's going to talk about children. And you may be sitting here going, well, I don't see any children in here. Look around you. You see any children in here? Jerry? Jerry's the youngest one here. I don't know about that. I'm not even going to take a poll. I'm smarter than that. Don't put me on the spot, Jerry. But look around you. See any children in here? But this applies to us, and I'm going to bring this to you. I want you to understand. So let's just go to chapter 6, verse 1. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, for which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. We'll just stop right there. So he says, children, obey your parents. Now, I don't know about you. Once upon a time, years and years and years ago, I was a children. Were you? Let's be honest, we were all children. And we looked at our parents and we sit there and we go, they are so old and fuddy-duddy, and the things that they think and the things that they do and the things that they want me to follow, they're so out of touch with today, right? I mean, let's be honest. Is that not really the way that most children are in the world? And was that not probably, and I'm not saying drastically, but in our minds at some point in time, our parents told us to do something and we really didn't care for it. So how are we honoring God in submitting to our parents whenever we had that thought process going on? You see? We need to recognize, and especially those who grew up in the church and had parents who were Christians, to understand, we needed to understand that our parents really loved us and cared for us and were looking out for our best interest and wanted to be able to impart to us some knowledge so that we wouldn't make the same foolish mistakes that they made. And I tried that with my children, and I know how that went. I've joked with you and told you about the rule that I had in the Smith household. There were 2 rules. You remember the 2 rules? I know some of you are smiling already. It was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. Rule number 1, Dad is always right. Rule number 2, in case Dad's wrong, go back to rule number 1, Dad is always right. And sometimes it was utter chaos because they didn't like Dad is always right. And I get that. And sometimes I was an utter failure at being a father. Let's just be honest. Fathers, we're not perfect. We do make mistakes. However, as parents, we have a responsibility to raise our children, and we're going to talk about that more here in just a minute, but we have a responsibility to raise our children so that they do well, moreover, that they do well in the Lord. That is our responsibility. So, Paul wants us to understand that as children, our responsibility as children is still to be willing to submit, even whenever we don't like it. Even when we don't think that they are right, rule number 1 still applies. Dad's always right. Somebody gets it. I wish my kids had got that. But here's the thing. The truth is, parents, I believe this, parents would give their lives for the sake of their children, to make sure that they're safe and they're well. After all, we have children. Are we not really devoting our lives as parents? So we have a responsibility as parents to raise our children in such a way that they are doing well. And I'll talk about that more here in just a minute. But the reality is children need to realize that parents have a lot of responsibility, and the thing that needs to come there is children need to honor and respect their parents. Now, let's take it down to crunch time. When does that stop? When the parent, he gets an A. When the parent is no more. I want you to remember in Matthew chapter 15, verse 3 through 6, Jesus condemns, if you will, the Pharisees because they have committed, if you will, this money or whatever to God. And then there's something that comes along with the parents. Well, let's go over to, hold your place here. Go over to Matthew chapter 15. Let's just read it. Here are the Pharisees, and they're wanting to know, well, why are you transgressing, if you will, the tradition of the elders? And Jesus comes back and he says, well, let me ask you a question. Verse 3, he answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God? Because of your tradition. See, they have a tradition. And here it is, for God commanded saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, here comes the tradition. Here's God's word, but you say, whoever says to father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me as a gift to God, then he needs not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. And notice what he calls them, hypocrites. You're just playing a part. So you're sitting there and you have parents. You're now grown and you have parents and you have a way to support or take care of them. And you're saying, well, I'd love to do that, but I can't really help you because I've committed this to God. What does God really care about? Does God need the money? It all belongs to God anyway. He can snap his fingers, if you will, he can just say a word, and whatever he needs happens. Does he need us? Does he need us? No. What he wants from us is honor your father and your mother. Treat them with respect. Now, I'm going to submit to you, Jesus is talking to people who are grown and their parents are now older. So when do we stop honoring our parents? When they're gone. And we still honor them and respect them then. We never stop. Even after they're gone, in our memories and in the things that we do. One of the things that I will never forget, you have to bear with me here. My grandfather passed away. I'm standing there, and a very good friend of my grandfather's came up, who was a mentor to me in the church. He is the one who got me started preaching. And he come up to me and he said, Mike, you know the best way that you can honor your grandfather and show him respect? You never leave the church, and you work for the Lord. Those words have stuck to me every day since then. You honor and respect them even when they're gone. So as children, we are children still. We will always be somebody's child. And we have a responsibility to honor our parents. And some of our parents probably were not the best parents. Some of our parents may have not been Christian parents, and some of them may have told us some things that were totally wrong. But they still deserve honor, and they still deserve respect. There's no loopholes here. There's just no loopholes. So let's go back to Ephesians chapter 6. And I want to pick up in verse 4. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So he's dealt with the children. And he says, you need to honor and you need to respect your parents. And we're just going to leave that at that because the words are simple. He says it's going to go well with you if you do. If you don't, it's not. That's not hard to understand. And I could give you 2 or 3 sermons on that right there. But then he says, fathers. And I want you to understand what he says here. Do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. It's interesting to me, and I've heard it said a lot of times, he says, a lot of people say parents. And that's true. Parents have a responsibility to raise their children. But he could have said parents here. He didn't. He just said parents in the first writing when he says parents should be honored. But he didn't say parents. He says fathers. You know why? Because fathers are the head of the household. Fathers are the ones that are supposed to be leading. Fathers are the one that God looks to. You remember back in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned? God didn't come to Eve and say, Eve, what have you done? He said, Adam. Adam, you're the one that's responsible. Fathers, we're the ones that are responsible to lead the house, to be the head. As Christ is the head of the church, fathers are to be the head of the house. Fathers. And it's interesting to me, whenever fathers come through and they say, I want you to do this, or I want you to not do that. How many times as children do we sit there and go, I really don't like what he says, even though he's my father? Fathers have a responsibility to raise their children in the Lord. So, I find it also interesting whenever he says, do not provoke your children to wrath. I don't know about women. I'm married to one, and I have 3 daughters, and I know they have their issues, if you will, in life. And as fathers, we have our issues in life. As a father, I'm just going to tell you from experience, as a father, sometimes I've seen my 3 kids run around like little gremlins, just about ready to... They could provoke you to the point where you just wanted to scream. And it's just kids, because they will test you to the point where you just can't hardly take it anymore. And what's the first thing that you want to do is lash out. I don't know about women. I'm not one. But I know my wife has a lot more patience in dealing with things like that than the father does. And sometimes the wife has to tell the father, take a walk, come back. Because fathers, we do have an issue sometimes. And that's why I see the word fathers here. It's especially important as fathers that we understand, don't provoke your children to wrath. Don't harass them. Don't make them feel like they're insignificant or worthless or whatever. They still need to be trained. They still need to be taught. They still need to be taught, if you will, and brought up in the instruction of the Lord. That's our responsibility. So we've got to have a head that is cool, calm, and collected. And sometimes that's tough to do as fathers. Chuck. It does.
As fathers, if we're going to lay down the rules and not have any discipline and self-control in how we do that, you can expect that that's going to produce rebellion within the children, and we're going to hang on to a bad rule. You know, so how we lay down those rules, we can't just make decrees that don't line up with God.
You're so right.
It's going to go over very well.
Right.
We're going to provoke them to wrath and rebellion.
And Chuck, you're exactly right. And Chuck brought up a point here that that needs to be brought up. So within that, whenever we do give instruction or we do give direction, okay, let's just take it down the road like this. Fathers, you tell your daughters or your sons they're going out and you say, I want you in before midnight. Well, how come? Now, I can lay down the rule, and if you were a kid growing up in the age when I grew up, children are to be seen and not heard. In other words, you don't question, you just be quiet and sit there, and whatever I say, just do it. And I can't tell you how many times I heard that. You just do it, I told you so. The better way to do that is, okay, how come? Well, nothing good happens after midnight. You ever heard that one? Nothing good takes place in the dark. You ever heard that one? Give them some instruction. Give them something to work with that says, here is the reason I'm telling you what I'm telling you. So let's just take it another step. Fathers, what are we teaching our children on a daily basis when it comes to God? Are we teaching them that nothing else in this world is more important than God? Or do we just tell them that? How important is God in your life? When I tell my children that nothing should be more important than God, do I support that by, let's make sure we're at worship. Let's make sure we're reading our Bible. Let's make sure that we're diligent in prayer. Let's make sure that we're doing these things and not just telling them, but showing them, here's what's most important, and I'm going to show it to you in my life. Here. Right. And that's so true. I mean, it says it's going to go well with you. Now, it doesn't mean that everything's going to be sunshine and rainbows. But whenever we are rebellious as children, things are not going to go well. But my point is simply that as fathers, we have a responsibility. And I'm going to tell you, it breaks my heart so many times I see parents, they raise their children and then the children depart and go someplace else. They're no longer a part of the body of Christ or whatever, and they sit there and go, I don't know where I went wrong. And I'm going, I've got a pretty good idea. It's what you taught them because you weren't at church and you weren't busy with the congregation and you weren't busy with people teaching your children that. You taught them the exact opposite. What did your life teach them? You see, we have a responsibility as fathers, Matt.
Just a thought. I like the way he's paired both a command to not provoke your children to anger or wrath, but it's also a command to bring them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord. Because as children get older, there could be times where the instruction and discipline of the Lord incites them to be angry because they're on a path that they shouldn't be on.
Yeah.
And it is not, we can't abdicate our responsibility as fathers.
Right.
Continue to bring them up in that instruction. That needs to hold first in our hearts.
Right.
Ultimately, because you care for their soul.
We do. And not only that, but in doing that, at some point in time, they're probably going to be parents too. What are we teaching them about being parents? Are they going to raise their children and teach them about the Lord? It's easy to go out here in the world and make sure, I want my children to do well in the world. I want them to be able to go out here and be productive in society. I want them to be able to have a good job and understand that they have a responsibility, and we'll talk about that more here in just a minute, but they have a responsibility in society to be a diligent and a good worker. They have that responsibility. But moreover, they have a responsibility about their souls to the Lord, and they're going to have to understand that and take account for that someday, and I need to cultivate that as much as I can. because they're going to answer to God too. I will answer to God for my actions, but they will answer to God for theirs. Okay. Thoughts, comments before we move on? Because we're going to move on real quick. Chuck?
I think the hypocrisy that parents have can be one of the strongest drivers of children to rebel.
Sure.
If mom and dad are saying one thing, but they're doing another thing, at some point the kids just can't cope with that anymore.
Right.
And when they get the freedom to do what they want, that's
Right.
exactly what they do.
Right.
Parents can correct their mistakes, but they're going to have to own up to them to their children, or have to explain to them that they're wrong.
Right.
You know, and once we do that, then the process of correcting and fixing it can begin to happen.
Right.
But until the parents own up to things, the situation with their children, when it's deteriorated like that, is not going to get better.
Right. So honestly, Chuck, it means taking responsibility for our actions previous to the time and then taking the responsibility on ourselves to say, you know, I was wrong about that. And you teach your children about humility even in that. Leroy?
It goes out so it's not bad every time. Sometimes there's not time to teach.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yes.
God says stuff like, you need to be baptized. You don't really have to understand everything about it. You need to do what he said.
Right.
And you can learn about it later.
Sure. Yep. Anything else? Okay, well, let's move on. Running out of time. So, it's easy in this next piece to sit there and go, well, this really doesn't apply to me. Because he's talking about really our service or being willing to walk worthy in our work. And it's easy to look at this and go, well, he says bondservants. Verse 5, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, who with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God, from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Let's just stop there for a minute. Some versions will say bondservants, some say slaves. Yeah, servants. But you got to remember, he is writing in a time where a lot of these people are slaves. Okay? Now, Paul a lot of times refers to himself as a bondservant. A lot of times, Paul refers to himself as a slave. They're one and the same with a slight difference. A slave can be a person who they're serving a master because they owe a debt. They're a slave, and it's really not because they choose to be, but that's because that's their lot in life at this time. Without going into a whole lot of history in this, you could become a slave, and if you served your 7 years and then you're free, you can choose that you sit there and say, well, I like this master, and, you know, he's given me a wife, and if I go out, I don't get to take her with me because I've been given a wife, and I've got a wife, and now I've got these lovely children, and I think I'll just stay and serve him. That's a bondservant. I choose to follow. Where a slave really doesn't have a choice. But the idea is if you're a bondservant, if you're a slave, if you're serving somebody, and here we are today, we're really not slaves, if you will, because you get to choose who you work for, I think. Don't you? Most of us. Unless you're on my farm and you're my child and you work for me till I'm done with you. No. But you understand. We have a choice of who we're going to work for. But we still have a responsibility as their servant, because we are serving them, and we have a responsibility to them. So let's just talk about that for a minute. In verse 5, he says, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh. Be obedient. Mike, you work for me, I want you to take out the trash. Well, I don't like taking out the trash. I'd rather you ask somebody else to take out the trash. I'm going to sit here and play at my computer for a while. You ever see people with that kind of an attitude? Mike, your job is to do this. Well, I really don't want to do that. Or I'll sit there and I'll get to it later. Well, Mike, I've got other things for you to do later. You see, I have a responsibility as a person who is a worker for whoever it is I'm working for, that whatever it is they need done, that I'm making the best use of my time and they are getting their dollar's worth. I will never forget in drafting 1 in high school, we had a teacher who imparted some very important wisdom to all of our class. There was 30 of us in here learning how to use drawing boards and T-squares and triangles and all that. And we were sitting there the first week and you do everything. And he said, whenever it comes time, put your boards away, get everything done. And he says, so that whenever the bell rings, it's time to go. And so we took that to mean, well, about 10 or 15 minutes before the bell rings, make sure you got everything put away and we can sit here and visit. Right? And we done that for about the first week. And I never thought a whole lot about it because everybody else is doing it. So, he's sitting up there writing and making notes and everything. And so Friday comes the first week and he says, okay, everybody go back and get your stuff out and put it back on your desk. Because you owe me, and he had taken each person and written down what time you put it away and what time the bell rang. He says, how long does it take to put a board away? You walk over there and you go, in the drawer. How long does that take? Oh, maybe 10 seconds. He says, all of you have wasted at least 10 or 15 minutes every day. You cheated me out of that time. Did you ever think about it that way? How much time do we cheat our bosses out of by doing the things that we do? Now, I'm not saying we can't get a drink of water. I'm not saying, but what I'm pointing to is how many times are we frivolous with our time and we're not really working as we would work for Christ? Because really, is that not what he's saying here? As you're working for your servant or as your master and you're the servant, if you're working for that person, you work for them like you would work for Christ. Or maybe, if we are honest with ourselves, maybe that's how we do work for Christ. And if we do, what are we saying about our life with Christ? How important is this? He says, not just with eye service. Don't sit there and just look busy, but be productive. And how many times, those of you who have jobs, how many times do you sit there and trust me, whenever I worked at even where I work now, I see people who are busy on their phones and doing different things, and I'm going, you're not paid to talk on your phone. You're paid to carry lumber. You're paid to drive a nail. You're paid to do this. Do we really need to stop at the water jug and talk for 20 minutes all the time? How long does it take to get a drink of water? Do we really think about that? He says, you do this with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart, with respect. Those who we choose to work for still deserve respect. Good master, bad master, you're working for them. They deserve respect because that is their position. The beauty of it is, if you don't like it, you can quit. These people didn't have that choice. And I've told a couple of people that if you don't like it, you can quit. There's another job over here. You can go find it. But you're working for me. not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Now we start seeing where the real issue is. It's in the heart. What's really going on in the heart? What's taking place in our heart as we're working? Because I'm going to tell you, other people are watching you. Other people are seeing what you're doing. They're seeing how you respond to a good or an evil master. You ever had somebody come up and say, how can you work for that guy and do that the way he treats you? I'm going to tell you, the thing to say is not say, well, I'm serving the Lord, because they don't get that. And especially if you tell him that. I'm working for the Lord. I'm really not working for you. We are. But you have to watch your words and how you say things like that. Ken? Well, I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that, but the scenario is still the same, because you're working for somebody and they deserve your respect. They deserve your very best. Now, granted, in the day and time that this is written, yeah, they could treat you unfairly, and even then, you still had the responsibility of serving them, because he doesn't say good masters or bad masters. He says no matter who they are, you're going to serve them as you're serving God. And so therein is the comparison that we need to look at. Chuck?
We all have the ability to choose our master to some degree or another, in that if we choose God as our master, then he's got it all worked out how we treat people, and if we treat people according to his ways, he'll elevate us out of the quagmire. And if we choose to serve darkness and we just do whatever we want, we will find ourselves descending into the quagmire.
Okay, but I want you, and I agree, because we are serving God, and he can bring favor upon us and make things better for us, even if we serve an evil or an unjust master. That can be so. However, I want to take you back, and let's just talk about a few people in days gone by. There was a guy by the name of Joseph, and he was sold into slavery, wasn't he? Did things go well for him? Not for a long time. Not for a long time. But how did he serve? Did he turn his back on what he needed to do? No. Understand that God was utilizing what was going on in his life, preparing him for something else that's coming. And we need to understand that a lot of times. As we're going through life, and maybe we have a hard master, maybe something's going on and it's really hard to deal with, God is probably preparing you. I can't say he is, because I'm not God, but God is probably preparing you for something bigger or greater or whatever down the road. But how are you going to serve? So he can bless you? Or are you going to serve and say, I'm not doing that? God wants to bless us all the time, but sometimes you got to go through fire to get there. But we got to serve as we're serving God, and understand, really, that's who we're serving. In our submission, no matter who we're serving and what we're doing, that's our service to the Lord. Are you willing to submit? Just as you go back to the wife and the husband situation, a wife who has a husband who won't lead or who is a hard person to live with. That's her service to the Lord. And God sees that. And He will bless you. Why? Ultimately, we're working for a heavenly reward. Is that really not what it's all about? No matter what we go through in this life, is it really not about what's waiting for us at the end? Isn't really that should be the first and foremost thing in my mind when I get up every day and I go out to do whatever it is I do? I'm working for a heavenly reward. Where's my treasure? I knew I wasn't going to get through this. Real quick, verse 9. Bear with me. And masters do the same thing to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Real quick, I want to just touch base on this. So we have those who are servants, those who are willing to serve, or going to serve, or are indebted, if you will, to serve back then. But you have your servants, and then you have those who are in a place of authority. And I'm going to say that even those who are in the place of being a servant are probably somebody who has authority at some point in time over something. Notice how he says to deal with this. Do the same things. Well, what did we just talk about? You do the same things, giving up threatening. Be careful how you use that power that you have as a person of authority. Because God is going to hold you accountable just as He does the ones who are serving you. And it's interesting, he says, there is no partiality with God. God doesn't care if you're a boss or an employee, a master, a slave. He doesn't care if you're male or female. He doesn't care if you're Jew or you're Greek. He doesn't care. We're all, in the eyes of the Lord, we're all the same. We all have one responsibility, and that is to be people who are willing to submit and treat others with love, and to understand that we're all working in a way that we can get to heaven in whatever role we play in life. That's who we are, and that's what we should be. Thank you for your time.